reducing the human equation in health, where it is damaged by attitudes or by negative thinking or by the pressure of problems. Long ago, Plato made the statement that all forms of government are satisfactory, suitable, and proper if they are honestly administered. That if the best rule and the rest obey, we have a proper commonwealth. He said that a good king was better than a bad dictator, and a good dictator better than a bad politician. All of these things already sum up to integrity. Now, the Neoplatonists took this problem a little further, namely that the only ultimate government that's going to solve our problems is self-government. We are going to have to do it for ourselves. And it is good to notice that this time particularly, that all over the country and in many parts of the world outside of this area, efforts are being made by individuals to do things for themselves, to correct the mistakes of leadership, to repair the damage of selfishness, and to overcome the consequences of ignorance. These processes are very encouraging. In fact, it's probably true to say that the present moment is one of the best that we've gone through in a long time, although to most people it is maybe one of the worst. It is the best because at last more and more people are beginning to think. They are beginning to realize that legislation will not result in integrity. Integrity comes with the individual himself. And after a while, we not only find the people ruling themselves, but the person ruling himself. The directives for such rulership, of course, arise from personal experience, from tradition, from the spiritual institutions of mankind, from the ancient philosophies, arts, and sciences, but most of all, from an interpretation of these values, by means of which they become part of a strong moral perspective on life. Now, when we come down to the individual, we find his condition very much mirrors the social situation of today. The society in which we live is seriously disturbed, and this disturbance is reflected in the attitudes of people. More and more, the individual is taking on the negative values, or lack of them, which are bothering us today. And out of all this comes fear, anxiety, objection, even violence. And all of these excesses react into the human being himself. I think the Oriental attitude was probably the best available. Namely, that the great problem is the individual learning to smooth out his own conduct, to find ways in which he can overcome or transmute the pressures which disturb him. One way, of course, of accomplishing this is to realize the reason why we are in trouble. To realize that we're in trouble because it is the only way in which the individual can be lured from his own mistakes. We are in trouble because we deserve them. All the troubles that we have are part of what the Oriental calls a karmic load. Now, karma is not a fatal punishment. Karma is simply the fact that when you do it wrong, we must be corrected. When we make a mistake, we must find for certain that we have made a mistake. And most of all, we must stop blaming our mistakes on other people. Most persons today will feel or say that they would be happy if it wasn't for something someone else was doing. Well, each of us has to finally realize that we cannot prevent what someone else is doing, but we can transmute the entire circumstance so that it can no longer damage ourselves. It does not mean that we have to accept the mistakes of others, but it does mean that we must try to understand them and find how to adapt the knowledge we gain from experience to the preservation of our own well-being. Health problems today are perhaps more serious than ever before. In spite of the numerous advancements in science, in spite of infinite research and continuous development of remedial agencies, the public health is not good. The public health is bad because of the tensions and stresses by which the person is influenced. In religion, for a long time, we had a strong line of defense against this. The individual, regardless of what church or faith he belonged to, tried to live what he claimed to believe. He tried to prove to himself and others that he was under the leadership of a spiritual integrity. When he read in the New Testament that Jesus admonished us all to be brethren, to unite in common cooperation, he tried to do this. But today, this type of thing is no longer as meaningful as it should be. We know that we should not be cruel, that we should not be selfish, that we should not kill or destroy. These things we accept upon the basis of our religious convictions. And about 3/4 of the earth's populations have convictions to this effect. Yet never before has there been more war and disturbance. And in the individual life, never more before has there been so much pressure, so many frustrated ambitions, and so many mistakes carefully and lovingly nourished. The situation, therefore, is that our religion is not at this time serving as an actual preventive of disorders. When we claim to be a Christian, the theory is that we shall obey the teachings of Christ. The acceptance of the fact that they are good is of very little practical value, unless this acceptance involves our definite dedication to fulfilling these statements. If we do really believe that we should love one another, then the fact that we are baptized or converted into a certain faith does not permit us to keep on disliking everybody in the name of God. We do not have the right to claim a religion that we do not practice. And we do not practice a religion unless it does something to change us for the better. Therefore, we have all over the world devout religious people who are not getting any better. In fact, they are getting a little worse. They're using their religion as a very powerful defense, and for their religion they are willing to die. But for their religion they are not willing to live. And this is a very sad state of affairs. But out of it comes the inevitable conclusion that the religion was the more important factor. No matter what we claim to believe, we are what we do. We are the standard of living by which we seek to face the problems of life. Actually, the temptations that affect us and burden us today are largely personal selfishness, grudges, and all kinds of negative attitudes that have no justification in any religion or philosophy worthwhile. Yet we do not have the skill or the wisdom or the strength to live what we believe. Back in the days when my esteemed grandmother was growing up, the problem was much simpler. She came from Massachusetts and was brought up in the mystical atmosphere of the New England Transcendentalists. These rather gentle people, like Thoreau and Emerson, had a very simple way of life, but they kept it. In the community in which she grew up, Haverhill, Massachusetts, people did not have to fight their neighbors to maintain their integrity. The neighbor had the same integrity as themselves. The individual who was uncomfortable was the one who failed to live the level of the integrities of the community. At that time, people were naturally inclined to be kind. They went to church, they tried to practice what they heard, and they also served each other in 1,000 gentle and kindly ways. All this has been changed. Today, the individual finds very little support from his personal environment. His friends, his relatives, his neighbors are all under the same pressures as himself, and they are all living to compromise their conduct to meet the advantages of profit. All this type of thing makes the person more alone. Instead of society supporting him, he now has to support society. Instead of being controlled, directed, and inspired by reasonable conduct around him, he is forced to try and maintain some kind of a reasonable conduct in the face of constant pressure. Out of this constant pressure comes a negative psychology. The individual gradually undermines his own life. He becomes more and more aware of the delinquencies of the time. He becomes more and more frustrated and unable to cope with a situation which he should never have been expected to face. This business of trying to make people of moderate integrity face incredible temptations is not reasonable or right. But it is so. It is the way it is. And each person has to either expect to follow the general pattern and suffer with the rest, or else he must attempt to live his own life constructively and let some of the others work it out for themselves. It is almost useless to try to convert other people. The individual who is susceptible to conversion generally is already well on the way to a better life. Those who do not agree, we can't do very much about. Conformity is not what we desire. We cannot solve this problem by all joining the same church. We cannot form it or answer it by having all people vote for the same candidates. The problem lies in the individual working out the reason why he does not feel good at this time. If he has headaches, backaches, and all kinds of symptoms which arise from the vagueness of his own attitudes, there is no way that health can be improved unless the individual recognizes the therapy of his own personal integrity. Until he accepts this and understands it, he is going to suffer from a series of vague conditions of worry, anxiety, argumentativeness. He is going to look in the newspaper and see nothing but the trouble. He is going to listen to the television and become more discontented and feel less able to cope. All of these things have to be handled by the person himself. But this was the reason he was put here in the first place. The individual was not put here to lean back and let someone else save him. We are here as a creation of creatures, and we have to work out our own salvation with diligence. We have to recognize that we are here to grow and not simply to have fun. Because if we do not grow, there will be nothing in the last analysis that is either funny or enjoyable. We are here to improve ourselves, correct our own mistakes, help where we can, and stand strong against the temptations to negative attitudes which so many people suffer from today. Even if we are successful in this, however, we will not be able to completely dispense with psychology or psychiatry. We will still need them. But we will get rid of the individual who is simply making himself sick by his own wrong approaches to life. Now, we are all reading the newspapers, and we are seeing the dismal situation that is developing. We are also observing a certain note of desperation arising in the upper echelons of human society. We are realizing that nations and communities, vast areas and small areas, are beginning to recognize that the change must be made by the individual, that we must grow. We can never pay any politician enough money so that he can grow for us. We have to do it ourselves. And the more pressure we have, the more we will be tempted to do it right. In the old days, when temptations were low and not too many of them, any definite minor variety, a breakaway from normalcy, was considered forgivable and forgettable. Today, this is no longer the case. Today, the problem must be faced directly. We have people all the time who are worried. And we have people all the time who are going more and more into a negative reaction. And we also have another large group of people, enlarging considerably, that are rushing around in one direction or another for a panacea for all this. They are trying to find some way of getting out of trouble without changing themselves, or that they can get on a boat that is going somewhere, but they are not the captain. This also is a very dismal failure. There is simply no way in which somebody else can make us strong unless we are willing to try. There's no way that we can find a philosophy of life that is adequate to our needs unless we are willing to live it. There's no longer any way in which we can join our way into security. We have to do it ourselves. With this in mind, then, there's a few recommendations that might be useful to us at this time. In the first place, we should add up and search out the situation we're in. Find out what kind of attitudes we have in general. Are we by nature optimistic or by nature pessimistic? When I say optimistic, I mean, is there a deep, abiding hope that is available under pressure and stress? Or are we those who are just waiting for the worst to get a little worser? Are we waiting every day for more bad news, and when it comes, sit back in a sad smile and say, I knew it? Are we really people who want to do something, or are we overwhelmed by the negation of things and decided that there's no hope? Well, there is always hope, and nature is so constituted that when an individual gets rid of all hopes, then nature slowly eliminates him and gives him a new chance later to improve his attitudes. But the world will not redeem itself, or peace will not descend upon us until the world itself unites in an effort to achieve it. And in this effort to achieve it, all good progress begins with the individual. Enough individuals make a certain move or assume a certain fact, society changes. It is not changed from the top, really. It is changed from the common average person, who is the most uncommon and miraculous of all creatures. If you have the tendency, therefore, to expect the worst, this you should start to work on as quickly as possible. I know people who have found one very simple cure for much of this. They have done it by a kind of retrospection, always expecting the worst. It has been suggested to some of them that they sit down quietly and look back over their own lives for over a period of years and find out just exactly what did happen to them. Is this knowing of despair and despondency really the result of a tragic life, or has it been simply an attitude which has chosen to ignore all good things and cling unto the ills? Can anyone really look back over a lifetime and not find many things that happened to them that were beautiful, helpful, constructive, and useful? Can we all look back over a period of time and find no friend who was ever any good? And if we did find this situation, have we really analyzed why? If we are friendless, is it because we have never been a friend, rather than never had one? If we are friendless, have we had one or two disappointments and then turned against the whole world? Also, if we look through this background, we may find a great many things that can be capitalized in terms of progress. We can learn to value the experiences we have had. We can discover what happened when we were over-gullible. We can find what happened when we lost our temper and made a bad situation worse. We can find out when we were cheated and maybe discover in the quietude of our own lives that that happened because we wanted something that wasn't right or reasonable in the first place. All of these types of reflections will help us to find out what kind of a background in our lives could be held responsible for our present attitudes. Now, there probably will be a tragedy or two all the way along. There'll never be a time when things do not at least occasionally go wrong. But looking back over a period of 40, 50, 60, 70 years, it would seem that we should find that we are reading a book, a biography or an autobiography, and that up to a certain point we have always made this book unreliable. We have always emphasized what has been done to us and not what we did to them. We have always taken the joy out of our own lives and then blamed someone else for it. But out of this careful reconsideration of our own conduct, we may very often find a new textbook, a new way of looking at things that can be tremendously helpful. Now, this is the reason for history on the larger scale of things. Today we are looking around and we see mostly history of war and pillage, and we look back upon war and pillage to the beginning when cave people threw stones at each other. But we have also done some very wonderful things which we lose sight of. We lose sight of the tremendous progresses that we have made in a great many fields of action. We realize what has happened in health, for example, that the average length of life back 2,000 years was around 30 years of life. Finally, we got it up in the 10th, 12th, and 11th century to 35 years. In the 18th and 17th centuries, we got it close to 60. Now the records give us more than 70, and it is increasing all the time. Many great diseases have been curbed. Many types of misunderstanding have been smoothed out. We are beginning to be interested in diet, nutrition, all of these things, all of which have old foundations but have been generally ignored. Those who ignore the lessons of the past most quickly are the ones who have the most powerful opportunities and privileges at the present time. It's useless, however, to assume that we are successful because of wealth which permits us to die of gluttony. These things have to be measured, but in measuring them we can also measure what philosophy has done for us, and we can observe the slow decline of it. How year after year, century after century, human stupidity and avarice has gradually blocked the course of normal mentation. We can see time after time how virtue was sacrificed to ambition, and little by little we can see the consequences of it. We see one empire after another go down. We find one civilization after another fail, almost always because of corruption. Nearly always we realize something that architecture has taught us, namely, that history is a continuing account of lost ground. The longer we go back, the better it was. The more we come forward, the worse it gets. On the grounds, of course, that greater opportunity to be better today than was ever available before, as it made it possible for us to be worse. Now, out of this, we have the people with various ailments. Now, actually, the ancients had quite a good idea of what was wrong with sick people. One of the most interesting of the older healers was Hippocrates of Kos. And he was the one who created what we call today the clinic. He was the first one to make a systematic study of the causes of disease. Also in Egypt, there was a priest who lived about 1,000 years BC, who did a work on the study of human health, and left behind him a papyrus, the medical papyrus, that was translated and brought into popular circulation only a few years ago. This old document describes ailments, how to treat them, what to do with them. But Hippocrates perhaps was the most successful. When they came to him sick, they gathered in the chapel of Asclepius, the god of healing, a great figure standing with a coiled serpent around a staff, which was a symbol of medicine, and the dog crouching at his feet, the symbol of the service of mankind. And when they got there, the sick people were put on cots and told to sleep for the first night in the temple. And they were to record the dreams that they had, or any experiences or memories that came to them which were dominant and treasurable. And in the morning, the physicians analyzed these reports, and upon this basis accomplished a great deal in the correction of human illness. The dream psychology told Hippocrates the secret attitudes of the people, and where these secret attitudes were bad, health had to suffer. So that the health was not necessarily merely in the dosing of the sick. It was in the cultivating of a proper relationship between the individual, the world in which he lived, and the divine power that governs it. Hippocrates was among the first to point out that all healing actually and inevitably comes from God. The physician is merely the servant of deity. What deity proclaims and decrees, the servant can fulfill. And Hippocrates was very certain that God gave his best health to those who most deserved it, and that he was the one that decided who deserved it. And this deserving was dependent upon character and conduct. So Hippocrates said in many instances that it was necessary for the person to change his ways. And this is always a stumbling block. We will change anything except our ways. We will do anything we're expected to do as long as it doesn't change anything that we're doing now. We see this in the narcotics problem. You see it in alcoholism. You see it where legislators get out and defend the right of the individual to get drunk. We want better laws, but they must not interfere with what people want to do. And if people want to destroy themselves, we should never create laws to prevent this. And if we do create laws, they are almost impossible to enforce, because the person is determined to do what he pleases. And the only final answer, as philosophy has pointed out, is that he must come to the point where he pleases to do that which is right. This is the only answer to most of the physical and emotional disorders of mankind. We cannot say to the individual successfully that he must do that which he will not willingly do. Perhaps we can force him to do it. We may be able to restrict him so that he has no choice but to do it. But when this happens, he becomes neurotic. Because the neurotic is when a person who can't do what he wants to do because he shouldn't. And this combination is almost beyond conflict. We can do very little about it. But we must try to find ways in which the person desires to do that which is best. Now, several circumstances come into that. The individual who is desperately ill and is uncertain about his survival very often has quite a streak of virtue appear in his nature. He is willing to do almost anything to get well. If the doctor tells him that he's got to change his diet, he'll promise If he is told that he has a definitely difficult disposition, he will agree, and he will swear that he will do something about it immediately. But he's told that he shouldn't keep his mind on his business while he's dying in his hospital bed, he will assure the physician that he has had no further interest in money, because he knows he's behind and beyond the case of where he can do anything about it. But the doctor watches carefully, and the first day that there is an improvement in the physical condition of the patient, he wants a copy of the Wall Street Journal. He's right back doing the things he's always done. As soon as there is hope, he will break the rules. When there seems to be no hope, he will keep the rules for a short time. Now, society is in much the same situation. When society is as bad off as it is here now in the world, it will promise almost anything. But as soon as it feels a little better, it will order its equivalent to the Wall Street Journal. It will go right back to what it wants to do. Confucius made this observation years ago in China, that the individual is in some mysterious way so dominated by his own will that he will continue in his course even if it leads to his own destruction. We find, for instance, nowadays a lot of emphasis on diets. Diets are a dozen a dollar. But all of these diets put together accomplish very little permanent result. The individual finally gives up trying, because it is too difficult upon him, or in case unwisely done, it is too dangerous. But all the way along the way, we are constantly tempted to do the things that we shouldn't do. And as many of these things are glamorous and apparently pleasant, we are almost certain to compromise our principles. Here is another phase of it. If the present television programs are not sufficient to create neurosis, they will continue until they do. We will find that more and more intelligent people are turning off the sets. This is a sign of a slowly emerging maturity. It is an indication that the individual is realizing to some degree that what he is watching influence his thoughts, his emotions, and his attitudes toward life. He is also beginning to realize that his children are being very adversely conditioned. And yet you pass a law to prevent this type of thing, and everyone nearly would vote against it. This is the type of problem we have in personal life, to try to make something work quietly, consistently, and intelligently. Some time ago, a group of people came together for a very interesting experiment. They were old friends and all knew each other, and each one was told to make a statement of what he considered to be the most detrimental factor in the life of one of the others. No names were put on. It was confidential, but each person finally had someone that told him why he was wrong. That worked pretty well. Well, I knew one of the members of that little group. They said I had a wonderful time. Of course, nobody paid any attention to it. They just kept on doing as they had been doing, and if they'd known who said it, there would have been an unpleasant relationship. But because nobody knew, it was all fun. But the truth of the matter was, many valuable suggestions were made, but they weren't followed. So start out some morning in the day as you go along, and see how you handle the day. See how long you can go without fretting, or without being interrupted in something you considered terribly important, or that you don't have an argument over the price of something, that you don't open a paper and find the world so bad you can hardly stand it, or that you go out and everyone is cheating you, and go on through until you finally catch up with relatives and relations and have even worse times with them. Keep on going through the day and see what you have actually accomplished in the way of smoothing out your own inner life. It was said by the Chinese that the wise men of old slept without dreams, and this was exactly what is meant. All these pressures finally come through into the subconscious and either come out through dream symbolism or out through character or body disorders. So see what you can notice. See whether you are always expecting the worst, and that you are desperately surprised if it doesn't happen, in fact a little disappointed, because when you expect something and it doesn't happen, in a sense it is an indictment of your own judgment, and people don't like that. But try to see what would happen if you could go through all these problems without being moved, without being discouraged, without being excited or irritated. The phone rings and it's the wrong number. That would be a chance to be irritated. But don't be irritated. You get a letter which is unpleasant, or you get a bill that you don't think you owe, or something of that kind, and more tension, more stress. And yet all the things that we consider to be dishonorable, and which we want to do something about, we can meet and handle without one single heave of the inner life. We can do it in a simple, matter-of-fact, reasonable way, without building any type of attitude. We can meet dishonesty with a simple attitude of realization that it is so, but no emotional stress. That we can try to solve problems with clear judgment and calm thinking, but without emotional excitement, fatigue, or worry. Things that are worth worrying about will not be changed by worry. Therefore, worries have to be faced quietly and solved. And there should be no overjudgment. We should never condemn ourselves constantly for something or condemn other people. We should look into our marriages and our relationships with our children and see just exactly what the background motivations are. Are we motivated by selfishness? Are we seeking escape from responsibility? If we are always looking to get away from the responsibilities of living and living only in an atmosphere of eternal opportunities, we'll be in trouble. Everything has its price. Happiness must be deserved. All the things that we want that are real and good, we must justly require because we deserve them, never because we want them. Our desires are beyond number, but our needs are few. So we gradually can get past this point, which especially in older years has a tendency to close in and interfere with health. The individual may live a long time, by the way, with a bad disposition. I've seen it happen. But it was not much of a success. They simply prolonged their own grudge against humanity. They only kept on being sorry for themselves, and it lasted a few long years of that attitude, when they would probably have been happier if they hadn't lived. It would have been much better if they'd gone at a reasonable age. But old age is an opportunity for philosophical consideration of values. It is an opportunity for the improvement of the inner life, and it is a continuing opportunity to learn and to grow. But if these factors are missing, then it is simply a burden. But the Lord arranged it that way because if people do not do what is right, whatever they do must be a burden. This type of thinking can work. It has come to the West quite a bit through Zen, which has been an Oriental philosophy of quietude, a philosophy that discovers realities, in a sense, by the humor of life, by the realization that so many of these terrible disasters are really funny if you can get away from your own ego. Many things that seem to us to be inevitable and terribly important fade entirely from the consciousness of a good Zen man. Zen is a quietude, a living smoothly through life, a living in which there is no rejection of duty, But duty no longer becomes a burden, it becomes a fulfillment. And an individual who serves with fretting and with reservations and considers himself underprivileged because his burdens are too heavy is simply losing the most beautiful opportunity for growth that there is. The heavier the burden, the greater the opportunity to grow. Growth does not come from lying down, like the old hymn says, and floating off to heaven on flowery beds of ease. It comes from hard work well done. If we can learn to like nature, we can have a much better time of it. Now, in the West, religion has gradually drifted away from responsibility. You very seldom see an article on modern religion that really gets down to the very heart of the matter. You very seldom hear a preacher who really gives an important sermon that has to do with people living up to their convictions if they have them. These things seem to fade away, and now membership in various religions is largely a social relationship. It is that the individual joins others who find an intelligent or attractive preacher and attend that church. But the real living of it is not given the thought that it should. And the vicarious atonement is just about as bad, if not worse. The individual is not relieved from the responsibility of his mistakes simply by acknowledging them. He must correct them. He must be able to prove that in every way he has sought to remove from his life that which is discrediting to himself or his environment. If the person keeps on worrying long enough, they have a series of problems that can become very unpleasant. It is a very common cause of nearly all chronic ailments. Chronic being something that represents a chronic factor in the disposition. The afflicted people have often recognized, and more often should have, that this chronic problem arises from unchangeable and inflexible attitudes that are wrong. It is the result of living a life with a wrong basic pattern of existence. And of course, this is becoming more common all the time, with education failing entirely to emphasize the importance of integrities in life. Everything now is to get there quick, make money fast, and run a computer. Without these great gracious factors, life is unimportant. Actually, education is not doing what it should. It is not helping a person to realize that he is responsible for his own conduct. An education that gives no inspiration undoubtedly weakens character and gradually brings the individual down to ruin. So we have to take over all these problems ourselves. We have to take them over in any way and every way that we can. We take them over sometimes in prayerfulness, in which we ask divine strength for the changes that we should make in ourselves. Prayerfulness is, however, not very effective if it is not accompanied by a distinct and definite effort to achieve the improvement that we believe to be necessary. Deity helps those that help themselves. And the individual who is trying and striving in the name of truth will be sustained and supported by truth. But unless there is a dedication to the improvement of a situation, nothing changes. Chronic ailments very often slow down the patterns of life. Emotional ailments of all kinds, hates, fears, and so forth, certainly affects their circulation and cardiac activities. The individual who has a poorly organized life physically and has been subject to constant emotional stress, fears, hates, anxieties, and worries, will surely have heart problems, will surely have the troubles with the body, trying to live through the mistakes of the dweller therein. To dwell in the body is a burden upon the spirit, but the body is never really to blame. The body is simply an overcoat. It's simply a vehicle that we use for an adjustment in the material world. The body in of itself is a very natural, healthy, kindly thing. But by the time we afflict it for generation after generation, and by heredity inherit a mass of delinquencies, the body comes to be uneasy. Now, no medicine can really correct this, because almost every medicine has to destroy some function. It has to slow down the worries by slowing down the thinking, and this is not the good answer. The individual, having inherited a body that has some aptitudes and some abilities, can consider himself to be a small god ruling over a little universe which is himself. Now, it's not such a small universe if you want to consider it correctly. There are more life units in the average human body than there are living things on the earth. One body. Billions and billions of living units that must work together for the salvation of the body. Over this is God. God in this case being the self that inhabits the body. This self has all kinds of privileges and opportunities. It can be a good and conscientious leader, serving wisely and lovingly the needs of the body. It can be a good master of builders and workers. It can be a great inspiration. It can regulate the conduct of the body so that it never becomes involved in dangerous pursuits. It also can prevent the individual from destroying his own body by intemperance. For intemperance in the body of man is something like the Atlantic deluge on the face of the earth. All of the things that are necessary to our survival can be controlled, and can be controlled by the master of the show. But if the self within this body is determined to use it for only the gratification of personal attitudes, if this individual will destroy rest, will lose the sense of humor, which is very dangerous, and will one way or another discourage and dissipate the body's functions, he will be sick. He will be sick because he has broken the rules that the body says it must keep. So in all the things we do in life and business and everything else, we are constantly breaking rules, and then in the newspaper a little later we hear about bankruptcies and great losses and various disasters to the life of the person. We also find now natural disasters. We find, as we do today, constant references now to floods, typhoons, earthquakes, plagues, pestilences are everywhere. And all these things together seem to add up to something. I know that long years ago I tried to make a research project on the correlation between earthquake phenomena and war. And there seems to be a definite relationship. Nearly always earthquakes are associated or very closely connected with social upheavals. Why, we do not necessarily know exactly, but there is some kind of a magnetic relationship between natural phenomena and the human being. I think this is well brought out in a very cute little article on the paper not long ago, that there was suddenly a complete loss of catfish in Japan. No one could buy a catfish. And when they searched into the matter a little ways, they found out that this catfish is the great Japanese earthquake warner. The catfish is the first to know that an earthquake is going to happen. So there was a report out seismologically that if earthquake threatens, and everybody went out and buys catfish. And they keep it in a little bowl at home, and they feed it regularly, and they watch it. And if the little catfish becomes very happy and flutters around in a perfectly natural way, all is well. But if it gets nervous and disturbed and jumps up and down in the tank and becomes obviously distraught, the earthquake will follow in a very short time. This is perhaps something a way of judging about Earth, that nearly all nature has ways of estimating approaching earthquakes. Now, if this is true, then is it not quite possible that there is a psychic connection between emotional conduct, visible circumstances, human attitudes, and seismic disorders? If the catfish gets unhappy and an earthquake follows, then we can say, or might be able to say, when mankind becomes unhappy and confused, a war follows. Wars and pestilences seemingly are simply the outcomes of some magnetic relationship between the individual and nature. We find them always increasing, and we now find a new type of earthquake, and that is terrorism. Terrorism is probably one of the last and ultimate forms of the proof of the failure of perspectives and circumstances. Here we have a race most highly developed in science and many other fields that is unable to correct or accomplish its own morality. These things we have to bear in mind, and while we can't do all about them all the time, we must realize that a temper fit is an earthquake in the body. We must realize that it is a highly detrimental thing, that it's something that is happening to us as a direct result of an unreasonable attitude, an unreasonable relationship with life, or the breaking of natural laws, which has forced nature to resource in trouble. We must realize all the time that plagues and pestilences arise in the body. We know what happens when the body is subjected to cocaine. We know what happens when it is subjected to marijuana. We know these things are what they are, but above everything else is the grim determination to do exactly as we please. Now, most people don't go to that extreme with it. They will not sacrifice willingly and knowingly life or health just to do what they please. But if the individual does what he pleases, and what he pleases is not right, he is bound to have trouble. And no amount of flavor that is pleasant will take care of the factors that have caused the trouble. Therefore, each person must recognize that there is only one way in which he can assure himself of a maximum bodily support for his mental and emotional life. And that is, that he is a good ruler over his body, that he takes proper care of it, that he does for it that which it needs, that he does not dissipate it, that he does not open himself to contagions and diseases simply because of carelessness or indifference. That if he does not think straight, he is going to suffer. And wherever he breaks the 10 Commandments, suffering gets in there somewhere. Every nation of importance in the whole world has had its equivalent of the 10 Commandments. They represent not necessarily the will of God in words imposed upon a prophet on the crest of Sinai. The 10 Commandments are man's natural realization over a period of thousands of years that affects follow causes as the wheel of the cart follows the foot of the ox. Whatever we do has its natural and inevitable consequence. Therefore we have 10 Commandments, and we also have additional commandments given by Christ. We have the 10 Commandments in China, in India, in Persia, in Egypt, in Greece, and Rome, in most cases disregarded. And as the disregard grew greater, the countries fell. Because these inevitable rules have to be obeyed. Now the Egyptians were a little more generous in this matter. They weren't satisfied with 10 or a dozen commandments. They had what was called the negative confession of faith, and it is found in the papyri of the Book of the Dead, which is more really the book of the coming forth by day, for it means it's the book that is placed with the body in the tomb when the spirit goes forth into the green valleys of Amentet. But in any event, that the spirit has to stand before the judgment of Osiris, where the scales of the balances stand, and he must make the confession of faith. And if he lies or contradicts himself or misstates something, the jury of assessors, from which our jury system later came, bear witness to this. And if his crimes are slight, he may be forgiven. If they are great, he must return to the world and try again. But in this confession of faith, he has to admit any fault that he has. And he also has to swear under oath as a spirit waiting for immortality, in which no longer any substitute is any value whatsoever. He has to say, in my life, I have never hated a human being. In my life, I have never dishonestly dealt with a human being. In my former life, I swear that wherever there was suffering, I did all I could to help. That I owe no man anything, that I have never borrowed money at usury, that I have never failed to pay my debts, that I have never failed to worship the gods, that I have never failed to keep the peace. All of these things, up to over 100 items, must be met before the soul can go into the blessed regions. Now this is a little extravagant perhaps, a little more than is absolutely necessary, but it meant that way back 5,000 years ago, the condition of human life, here and hereafter, is based upon a code of solid integrities. These integrities are the basis of right action, that the individual who has never failed to support his parents, who has never failed to guard and guide the lives of his children, all these things he has to affirm. And the assessors, who have all kinds of metaphysical eyes to see things, can instantly detect any error or any falsification that he makes. So this is perhaps an ideal statement of earth and its ultimate, man's destiny carried forward into the infinity. But the fact remains that these codes of conduct, where kept, protect nations. Where broken, nations fall. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire, as set forth by Gibbon, is a good example of this. It shows how little by little a strong and upright people gradually deteriorated into luxury and dissipation, and were gradually overwhelmed by barbarians who were still clean. We have this today, except that we're short of barbarians. We no longer have other tribes that are going to come in. If anything goes wrong now, it must be ourselves doing it to ourselves. But the fact remains that health, happiness, security, integrity, and a proper relationship with life demands self-discipline. It demands that we learn to do those things which are right, and do them now. And it's very unpleasant and disillusioning to see selfishness masquerading as religion, self-interest, and ulterior motives supported or sustained by so-called quotations from Scripture, to find that the individual uses these principles not to improve himself, but in one way or another to avoid them and try to force them on others. It's absolutely necessary for this generation to find itself in a way that it can then turn to other things. The moment the individual becomes integrated and no longer supports or advocates or endures the corruptions of his time, he becomes in a sense free. He may lose his opportunity for great wealth. He may not be the one that is promoted to the highest position, but he is the individual who is gradually changing himself into a citizen of eternity. He is a person who is living in the true universe as it is, a universe of integrities, a universe of honor. He is preparing himself for infinite citizenship in an infinite plan of things. Whereas those who are not so dedicated must in due time return and stay with it until they awaken to these values. Now, these values are not going to all awaken at once, even in one person. They're going to grow slowly as the individual begins to appreciate and understand his real needs. They're going to become more and more obvious to him as he grows. If he takes the first step towards self-improvement, the second step will be easier and more obvious. All the way along, he is in the position, as soon as he so desires, to realize that his time in this world is brief. And though he may return a number of times, even altogether it will be brief. But he is here to become aware of the infinity of his own inner life. He is here to know that a divine power lives in him, and that this divine power is crucified every time he corrupts himself. That it is necessary for him, therefore, to protect this being within him from that personality which is indeed a holy sepulchre, from which that being must rise triumphant through the accomplishment of discipline and integration and illumination. Now, illumination is a term in religion which has many meanings. Some consider illumination to be a form of clairvoyance or second sight. Some consider illumination to be a mystical experience involving values completely out of this world. Some regard it as the highest possible experience of religious values. But illumination, what it is finally and all summed up, is a complete acceptance and realization that our destiny is in our own hands. Its illumination is the realization that the path that we should follow is the path which will bring us in the end to reunion and identity with the divine being. That illumination is the revelation of our own need and how it can be solved. It is a statement of an internal presence which breaks through for a moment and gives us a message that we must never forget. Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, said that he had illumination for only a few seconds twice during his lifetime, but that these 2 or 3 seconds of really internal, full comprehension of the entire pattern of things became so important that they could never be forgotten, and nothing could ever be done contrary to them, because there was the inevitable stamp of eternity upon them. And in the presence of that, all earthly pressures instantly faded away. The person starting out now with the hope of improving health can start with little ordinary things, a little greater integrities, a little greater sincerities. Sincerity is the most powerful force. When the individual is totally sincere, he is seldom completely wrong. He is always trying to do something better. Sincerity is lack of ulterior motive. An ulterior motive is one of the deadliest of the sins. If we have all kinds of little corruptions floating around in our natures, we're going to have heartaches, headaches, we're going to have high blood pressure, we're going to have all kinds of things, because these attitudes actually damage the little cells and lives within ourselves. The human body is a strange magnetic field. It is a field of infinite life in motion. The human body is a field for a great magnetic sphere which surrounds it. The human body is tied to all of its parts by magnetic pressures and by attitudes. The magnetic field is in many colors. And as you study the situation very carefully, you make some interesting discoveries. With every mood that the individual has, the colors of the magnetic field change. They can be the colors of rainbows. They can be beautiful shades. Or if the individual is jealous or nagging or combative, dirty colors come in, dull, unpleasant, storm-like appearances. And in this magnetic field, as in a small universe, great thunderstorms can arise, lightning can flash, torrents and torments spring up. The purgatory seems to flare in the very atmosphere. All of these things are the result of the individual misusing his own abilities and powers. The magnetic field is a kind of psychic thermometer which tells how near the truth he is. And wherever there is a departure from truth, these magnetic currents are disturbed. And wherever they are disturbed, organs are disturbed, particularly the endocrine system. And when the endocrine system is disturbed, that all the physical functions become disturbed, disordered, and sick. Therefore, an individual who is wrong is bound to be sick at something. He's mentally sick, emotionally sick, physically sick, psychologically sick. He is either healthy because he is right or unhealthy because he is wrong. The great problems of life come as we don't always quite understand a statement attributed in the Bible, namely that it is not that which goeth in at the mouth, but that which cometh out of the mouth that defileth a man. It sounds as though, by best dietitians, it should be the opposite. But it is right, because that which comes to us from the inside, from the outside, is not our problem. It is something which would meet with the best that we have. But what comes out of ourselves, out of our hearts, our minds, our bodies, our thoughts, these things, if they are wrong, they are the things which destroy or damage the human being. Every unkind word that is spoken to us is carried by someone, but not by us. But every unpleasant or destructive word we pronounce is ours, and we must live with it until we transmute it. And the great alchemy of life, to my mind, is the power to transmute the inabilities and incompletenesses and the infirmities of ourselves into eternal assets. This transformation is the regeneration of the individual. This was the great secret of mysticism. This was the secret work of the Rosicrucians and the alchemists and all of the ancient secret societies. Everything had to do with the individual gaining the power to discipline himself, to rise above his own weaknesses, and to become a living image of truth in a world disordered. And if we do this, we have the natural compensation. We find that we are allowed to face life in an entirely different way. And no matter what happens, happy or unhappy, we will face it. And we'll find in the end a joy that can never be found from a mistake. Now we watch the economic and political processes going around us today. They are rather pathetic, they are tiresome, they are wearisome, they frighten us. And we don't know what's going to happen next. But actually, the person who is integrated, who is really at peace with themselves, who lives in a realization of the presence of the divine in all things that happens, is able to realize that he should not forget the presence of the divine in the things he doesn't like. It is easy enough to think that if all people lived developed in peace, and served each other nobly and generously and kindly, that then we'd have the utopia. And that anything less than that is something that we have to accept as a terrible thing. Actually, the things that happen to us are not terrible things. They are merely our own birds coming home to roost. They are the things we have done returning to us. When we stop causing trouble, trouble stops. But this trouble that we have is a great inspiration to get over it. In the last 2 or 3 years, there has been more movement towards individuals taking on the responsibilities of life. There are more efforts to find peace, not by law, but by people gathering in contemplative integrity.
There are more efforts to reform education. There are new attitudes toward law, to science, and to philosophy. And philosophy, which for the last decade or two has been very moribund, is apt to come to life again. We don't have much in philosophy because it is nearly all in the field of experimental thinking. But the old classic works are coming back. I've noticed in catalogs that books that have been out of print, very valuable books, that have been out of print for 100 years, are now coming back by the dozens. Everyone is beginning to be interested in the thinking and the deep believing, the loving, the hoping of the great world family. And that modern reading, with its very tempestuous iconoclasm, is of no value to us in our needs. What we need is to find our roots again in the wisdom literature of our race, and find in all the things that we do everything that is inspiring and clinging to it. Actually, in this field of thinking, of constructive reorganization, there is a tremendous increase, and every bombing, every massacre is bringing the day of wisdom closer. And as Krishna at the Battle of Kurukshetra in India, when he appeared to the charioteer Arjuna, the Prince of Men, Arjuna said, "How shall it be that I can go and make war to my own family? For I see the army drawn up, and my own family is there waiting to attack me, and I am waiting to attack them." And Krishna appeared in a vision at that moment, and reminded the young prince, he said, "Do not fear. Never the living can die. Nothing can be anything but change. No one will ever kill anyone. It is all a great dream world, a world of physical factors which we have made real, when the great world of beauty that we should have been making real has been ignored. All these things that are happening are dreams. Those who die in battle will live in peace. Those who do all these things will rise again, wiser, a little better, a little more noble, a little more unselfish. And that these things are all shadows, phantoms, passing, the inevitable consequences of man's inhumanity to man. But out of it all will rise the one great humanity, acceptable to God. All these things we have to face, but in daily life most of us do not face the worst of it. But we can worry about the worst of it. But the most important thing is not to worry, but to make sure that in our personal actions, in our personal thoughts and attitudes, we see the truth, we believe in the truth, we decide to live the truth, and we have not a hope based upon phantoms, but an absolute certainty that in the great plan of things, everything works together for good. Out of all the confusion, the chaos, the suffering, and the pain comes a great solution. And it is for that reason that we were created. We were created to grow and to finally become conscious of our divine birthright and conscious of our place in an infinite plan that is governed not only by the wisdom of God, but by the love of man to man and the truth that we hope gradually to make manifest. The whole thing is not one to get all sick and sad about. It is a thing that we must accept and transmute ourselves into the realization that we are in a universe that is not the object and subject of infinite human vicissitudes, but that man ultimately must follow the path that was his in the beginning. Out of this great materialistic urge for success has come a great disaster. And it will continue as long as man puts the wrong things first. But when he realizes the facts of things, when he realizes the truth, he will ascend to be greater than the angels. He is here to learn, but it must be the hard way. because it is constantly fighting his own negative, inherited dispositional trends and characteristics. But if you want to be healthy, you want to get over the pressures of the time, you must take a larger look and see beyond all the tyrannies of human relationship the magnificent and eternal love of God for everything that lives. For all of this is going together to bring about this golden time we look for, a time which will be better than anything we have ever known. But each of us must wake up as individuals and begin to understand and see what it's all about. Well, thank you very much.
In the problem of Atlantis, I think there are a number of points that have not been generally considered. We think of Atlantis as an island, probably somewhere in the Atlantic, and probably about in the location of the present Azores Islands. But actually, Atlantis was a diffusion. If you buy a map now of the world as it is today, we can say that that is the modern distribution. But to have a map of Atlantis as it was in the time of its glory, you would have to have a map of the entire planet, because it was a distribution. Continents rose and fell, islands came up and went down, great land shifts occurred, and the Atlantic distribution of land was far more important and far more far-reaching than the mere problem of an island somewhere in the ocean. So we have to think of Atlantis in relationship to a complete pattern of the planet. As Plato clearly points out, the island of Poseidonis, which we now think of as Atlantis, was the last fragment of a great empire. It was the last surviving part, and is supposed to have disappeared under the ocean about 12,000 years before the Trojan War, which would make it about 15,000 years ago. Now, in connection with the problem of Atlantis, I think the next thing we have to study is the name. Plato refers to the mysterious empire as Atlantis. He probably received this name, or secured it, from Solon, who in turn had received it from the priests of the Egyptian temple at Sais. Now, the word Atlantis, or its root, is not Egyptian, and it is not Greek. No one seems to be able to trace the origin of the name. It appears on two very important phases of ancient mythology, Atlantis and Atlas. And the root is ATL, Atal. Now, if we look to find the language in which that word or that root is permissible or was used, we find we have to come to the Western Hemisphere, because Atal was one of the month names of the Mayas. It also has more than just a name significance. Its glyph, or its symbol, is a deluge. This seems then to give us the real basis of our word, that we are dealing with a term that represents a world experience, that various countries were involved in it, that the circumstances were known around the entire planet, and that the name that has survived to us today is probably based upon the records on the Western Hemisphere. Now, if we take the general term to represent this mysterious region, we then can find from the Codex Troano, which is in the museum in Madrid, one of the surviving documents of the Mayas, that this particular deluge is marked in the glyphs of the people. The story is told in pictures, but among these pictures there is one in which the sky dragon, or the sky serpent, is pouring water from its mouth, and below this the god of death is dancing on the earth. Now, this was a long time ago, long before the coming of the Spaniards, but the records even go much further than that. According to the Chinese, the previous existence before our present coming to this earth was destroyed. The previous world was destroyed by water, a tremendous deluge. And in the I Ching, the 8 trigrams, basic trigrams, correspond to Noah and his wife, their 3 sons and their 3 wives, were the 8 who were saved. And this is exactly what the Chinese tell us. So the story goes around here and there and everywhere. It's a very interesting story, but what does it really mean? Is it merely an archaeological curiosity, or does it have some dynamic value for us today? I would like to think of Atlantis much as Lord Bacon did in his book, The New Atlantis, in which he says in very simple terms, the New Atlantis, which is America. Bacon was quite convinced that on the Western Hemisphere a great empire would arise, an empire that would surpass the glory of the Atlantean story, and that this new world would not be destroyed. It would not turn against the gods. It would not misuse the energies of nature, and as a result would become a new world, a restoration of the Golden Age. Now, when we study this Atlantean problem a little more carefully, we realize there have been a number of speculations on this. Vice President Dawes made quite an extensive search for the Atlantean world. A number of good archaeologists and ethnologists have devoted time to it. And the general attitude is no longer to discard it as a fable, but to try to find out what its actual meaning could be. Now let us suppose that Solon was correct, and that Solon, being an old man, was unable to do what he had intended to do, and that was to write out an account of the lost Atlantis as he found it, or it was given to him, in the caves under the Temple of Sais in Egypt. Here on columns formed of orichalcum, a metal that cannot perish, was recorded the story of a lost world. These two tablets are sometimes referred to as the Tables of Enoch, and we find a great deal of mystical lore surrounding this story. In any event, Solon, being very old and unable to carry on the work, passed the legend on to one of his descendants who was a student of Plato's. And this student, in turn, told Plato, who took the story, to use it as a great symbolical account of the descent of man. Now, Plato does not deny that the story is literally true, but he does point out so many very subtle and unusual details that we are forced to realize that he embellished it to represent the entire story of the planet Earth and its development. According to Plato, at a remote time, the gods of high Olympus distributed the world to their various sub-deities, and to Poseidon was given the lands of the sea, the great oceans, the islands, the archipelagos. And Poseidon created his kingdom in the oceans, and he created a wonderful city called the City of the Golden Gate. And in this city there was the temple to him, and in this temple were the tablets containing the laws of life, the laws that must be obeyed if man is to survive and to enjoy the favors of the gods. And the Atlantic Empire consisted of 7 islands. These 7 islands also occur in the Mexican story. These islands came together to form a league, and this league in turn created a kind of empire. And in the course of ages, the princes of the islands of the Atlantides became very proud. They decided that they would conquer the world. So in order to achieve this great end, they decided to send expeditions of conquest over all the other parts of the then Atlantean distribution. Now this distribution at that time consisted, much as it does today, of countries of various degrees of development. It was not an uninhabited world. The Atlanteans were not the only people. But these other people were comparatively primitive. They were like the natives of Africa or the natives of some Polynesian area, or perhaps the natives of some distant islands of the South Pacific. They were primitive people, but they existed. And the Atlantean merchants went to them, traded with them, and bartered with them. Plato states definitely that Atlantis had a great mercantile, that it traveled to all parts of the world, that it even visited Europe and as far south as South America. But gradually this empire grew more and more proud. Gradually fame, wealth, and power became the great objectives for life. And there was another dimension. These peoples possessed extrasensory perceptions that had not yet been closed by the process of embodiment. They were like the extrasensory perceptions of small children, in whom faculties are partly active, which are now dormant in our racial groups. So in any way, these magicians, these sorcerers, these powerful ones who possessed vril being the one motive power that is inexhaustible, something we could use today, that would carry anything transport anything, activate anything that the human being could conceive. And so in their pride, these princes decided near the end of their time to invade what is now Europe. They decided to invade in the areas of the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Near East. So they sent great fleets to conquer these countries. In the meantime, the deities, particularly Poseidon, realizing what was occurring, gave warnings and sent prophets and told these people they were destroying themselves, but they were proud and they gave no mind or no thought to consequence. And finally they rebelled against the gods, and the gods reacted accordingly. In a single night, the great center of Atlantean culture, the island of Posidonis, the last surviving fragment of an ancient order of life, disappeared under the ocean, and according to the Maya calendar, carried with it to death 60 million human beings. This was the end of a great cycle of misuses and abuses in which those powers, forces, and principles which had been intended to be of common good to all mankind were perverted and in one way or another turned against the will of heaven, and in consequence they were destroyed. Now this also causes us to have another little interlude here, which I think we should give a thought to. We are told by Plato and several other historians of the time that various agencies, various merchants, travelers, explorers from Atlantis visited other lands. And among those who visited other lands were the priests of the Atlanteans, those who worshipped the great golden serpent. Serpent worship was one of the oldest religions of the world. Now these various missionaries, shall we say, went to primitive people, as we send missionaries today to underprivileged or gradually evolving groups. And these missionaries set up various institutions in the distant parts of the empire, the parts that were not actually destroyed by the destruction of the Atlantean centerland. Now, it seems to me, and I realize that this is hypothetical, but it seems to me that this explains a series of legends and myths which are of interest. We are told, for example, that the people of Chaldea and Babylonia were very primitive, that they had not yet discovered the use of fire, that they did not know how to cook food, they did not know how to keep records, they had no medical knowledge, they had no laws to live by and no governments except tribal communes. And in the midst of all this time, while they were living along the shores of the sea, one day something strange happened. A being came out of the sea. This being, whom they called Oannes, had the body of a fish and the head of a human being, and wore on his head the head of a fish on end. If you see the old pictures, you realize that his hat was what we call today a mitre, which is practically exactly the shape of a fish's head. And this man who came out of the sea had scales. Now, scales could very well represent armor. He carried symbols with him, and he was a good man. And he came to these people, and he taught them. He gave them a written language. He gave them the knowledge of agriculture. He taught them astronomy and the mystery of the stars. He helped them to build a permanent government, introduced them into the mysteries of architecture and the building of cities. And he also taught them the mysteries of heaven and the ways of the gods, and taught them to live in obedience. And he told them that in due time he would return. And then he went back to the sea, promising to come back one of these days, sometime in the future. And he walked out into the sea and disappeared. Now this seems to me to be a veiled story, could be a veiled story, of an Atlantean traveler, a missionary perhaps, who came to these people very much as the Chaldeans coming along the coast of Brittany and France gave them the beginnings of the culture of the Druids. This one who came out of the sea, he dressed in armor, probably came on a ship, which came over the horizon and was regarded as evidence that he came out of the sea. The most important thing, I think, in the legend is that he promised to return. So they waited. And they kept his laws and they kept his rules for years, but he never came back. Now on the opposite side of the world, something else was happening. The people of Central America were living in a very primitive state. Some of them were cannibals. They had no homes except rude huts. They had no instruments except cut from stone. They did not know how to cook their food. They had no written language and no way of recording their history, no knowledge of any of these things. And while they lived in this primitive condition, a strange thing happened. An old man came to them, riding on the back of serpents. And he came to the shore, and he was welcomed by them, these peoples. And his name is preserved in the three great languages of the central culture of the period in time and place. To the Aztecs, he was Kukulkan. To the ones who lived around Palenque, he was Wotan. And to the Mayas, he was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. And this man came from the sea with a bonnet of wonderful plumes, almost like wings. And on his breast he carried a cross. He came to them, and they received him with regard and esteem. And he taught them all the things that Oannes had taught the Chaldeans. He helped them to establish a permanent way of life. He gave them the beginnings of a written language, the only written language in the Western Hemisphere. He gave them good government. And then he said, now I go away. But keep the rules that I've given you. And in due time, I will return and claim the empire. But in the meantime, obey the principles I have taught. And these principles were of very high quality morally and ethically. Then this being went to the shores of the sea. And as he stood there, he said to the people that had assembled that a very bad power was coming to them. Tezcatlipoca, the god of war, was going to come from the south to destroy their empire. They should be true, however. They should keep the rules, and then he would return. Then there are two accounts of what happened to him. One that he called to the sea, and the raft of serpents returned. The raft of serpents could well have been a ship, with the very animal heads and so forth that were engraved and written or painted or carved on the heads of ships. The other explanation is that he was transfigured and rose to become immortalized and deified in the planet Venus. He said, I will come back. But he never came. And when the Spaniards arrived, many centuries later, and their ships were anchored, the Aztec Emperor Montezuma took the plumes on the crowns, took all the symbols of regality, and sent them by ambassador to Cortes, saying that he was Quetzalcoatl returned, and that therefore he was returning the kingdom which his people had kept trustworthy for ages. These stories are interesting. There's nothing you can do but remember these strange stories. The same story exists in China. In China, the world's reformation, the restoration of humanity, was the result of a mysterious being who came out of a fish's mouth, and rising out of the sea taught them the secrets of life. In India, Vishnu, in his first incarnation, is born from the fish's mouth. Everywhere the sea was the source of instruction. Something came from the sea. We can't dogmatize what it is, but it is interesting that at a remote period, certainly 8,000 or 10,000 years ago, if not more, doctrines and concepts and beliefs reached all parts of the world and are still reserved and preserved in all the mythologies, legends, and allegories of ancient peoples, and were recognized as the ultimate source of civilization. Now, if these were missionaries, travelers, philanthropists from the Atlantean Empire, they might have wished to come back. They might have said that they would, or that others would follow. And then came the deluge. The center of the great wheel was destroyed. No one could come back. Little by little, these peoples in different areas modified their beliefs. Interracial minglings brought about complications of stories concerning the descent of knowledge. Here in the southwest of the United States, they have the legend that originally humanity lived under the earth. And a deluge came under the earth. And this deluge threatened the life of everything that lived. So humanity crawled up or climbed up to this upper world upon cornstalks and began to populate the earth. And the point where they came out of the earth is still sacred to the Navajo and the Hopi. Years ago, I had the privilege of bringing to California temporarily as my guest one of the last of the great sand painters of the Navajo, Faustin Clark. A few weeks ago, when I was in Sedona, in Arizona, I mentioned Clark, and everyone knew who he was. One of the greatest men of his time, an Indian, and a remarkable person. At that time, when he was up there, we had just published our large book, and I wanted him to see it. He spoke no English. He had no idea what the book was about. So I turned to the plate of the Table of Hermes, just in passing along through the book. You'll find it if you have it. And the old Indian stopped right there. It was Chaldean. He didn't know what Chaldean was, never heard of it. But he told me through Askenaswood, his interpreter, long, long ago, my people could read this. American Indian. Every once in a while, something like this happens, and no one knows why. But it all adds up to something that is very unusual and very interesting. I think if we follow all of the traditions that exist, we would summarize the highest terminal aspect of Atlantean culture as a very high culture, with scientific knowledge, with good map making, with many types of industry, arts, and sciences, accredited as having the first to domesticate the horse, with hospitals and clinics, and with various types of locomotion. And according to the old stories, the Atlanteans had the secret of flying through the air. We can doubt all these things. We don't know for certain. But we do know that there was on this planet at least 12, 15, 50,000 years ago, because the Atlantean diffusion and its empires probably lasted for better than 200,000 years before the final destruction of Poseidonis, that there was a great civilization. One of the Hindu scriptures says, referring to the earth, the Great Mother has shaken many civilizations from her back. And maybe Atlantis was one of them. Maybe Lemuria was another. Perhaps Hyperborea was another. But in any event, far back, there were forms of life and culture very different from what we have today, which destroyed themselves by the misuse of the spiritual powers of life. So now we come to another interesting episode. In the last few years, there's been a great deal of emphasis upon extraterrestrials visiting our planet. Books have been written to show that somebody from outer space, presumably, who came here long ago, produced all kinds of mysterious monuments, records, engravings, pictures, and carvings, are supposed to have had airplanes, all this type of thing, and it was said to have come somewhere from outer space. The outer space theory has certain difficulties involving it, which have not been completely solved and may not be solved. We don't know. It may all be true. But what we seemingly have overlooked is the possibility that these records that we now consider to arise from extraterrestrial sources could be the records of the great civilizations that were here before they destroyed themselves. That these people who are said to have come and brought all the secrets of life to these primitive peoples could have been the citizens of the great Atlantic Empire, the empire that was far higher and far more advanced in many ways even than we are today. Their civilization was different. They were not bound tremendously to an industrial program. They didn't need it, and we wouldn't need it if we developed the resources within ourselves. The idea that we have to run the planet the way we're running it now simply means that we do not recognize that within ourselves are the answers to the questions that we now find so difficult. That actually, if we use the interior potential we have, we would have no need of all the problems of depressions and all the mysteries of exploitation that we suffer from today. How would it be to imagine for a moment at least that these so-called visitors were actually the Atlanteans? There is a long story of their activities, whereas the story concerning extraterrestrials is rather dim and hard to put together. We base the extraterrestrial idea on one point alone, namely that something was brought here or came here at a time before it would seem possible that the human being could have developed or evolved these resources. Some believe that they brought with them electric batteries. Others believe that they wore space suits. Some say they came in space ships. But none of these things really exist to our minds except in the form of paintings and carvings and imageries of one kind or another. The main foundation of our belief is that something happened by which a culture came here or was here prior to our ability to trace its source. If we assume that there was a great source already here, it would simplify a number of matters and make it much easier to account for the travel of these mysterious visitors. Suppose these mysterious visitors were simply part of an advanced culture here. I think we have the same thing in problems today. There are still areas in this planet right now where it is very dangerous for strangers to go. There are still primitive peoples who have no idea whatsoever of civilization and have never heard of it. And in spite of the tremendous spread of our way of life, there are large areas which have not been touched, or so lightly as to mean very little. If in a more ancient time, most of the planet consisted of comparatively primitive peoples, and the last of the great Atlantean diffusion, Posidonus, was an isolated island, separated by water from practically all other areas on Earth. Most people living in other parts of the planet would have no knowledge of it, or if they had a knowledge, it would only be a legend, and perhaps the legend is responsible for another series of interesting beliefs. The World Mountain, Olympus, Asgard of the Nordic peoples, the whole series of the demigods who walked with men, the individuals who had apparently supreme power. Montezuma bowed down to them, and they were Spaniards in armor, and Montezuma believed from report that these men were centaurs, half man and half horse, and was not able to understand that these men were riding horses, which the Indians knew nothing about. Here, less than 500 years ago, we have a situation in which a higher cultured civilization moved in on the primitive one and was mistaken for gods, until they proved that instead of being gods, they were ravishers of the earth. So, with that type of thinking, we might also find a source for much of our religious thinking. These mysterious priests of the serpent of the city of the sun. These priests were undoubtedly wise in the mysteries of life. The ancient rites and mysteries of the Greeks and Romans and Egyptians, the secret and esoteric teachings that have descended to us from unknown antiquity, may very well have originated among the esotericists of Atlantis. There also seems to be quite a little evidence to the effect that when the great decision was made and the gods decreed that the Atlanteans had destroyed themselves and must be removed from the earth, that prophets arose among them in those last days before the end. And these prophets warned the people that they had disobeyed the gods, that they had sacrificed all that was good for selfishness, avarice, and power. And these prophets led certain groups of the Atlanteans away from Atlantis and into what is now Europe and the Near East. These peoples survived. As this migration occurred at least 12 to 15,000 years ago, we have some suspicion that many of the civilizations of the Near East, and perhaps even of the Far East, originated among these transplanted peoples who had gone away from the cause of death. It is stated in the Atlantic story that a great number of the gods of Egypt were, we'll say, refugees from Atlantis. That the gods of the Egyptians were Atlantean deities who originally, perhaps, actually and physically lived as leaders of their peoples. In any event, the idea that the world was populated, in one sense, by refugees is not unreasonable. Another story of the same type, which is found in many parts of the world, states that the Atlanteans earned their final destruction by an attempt to invade Europe. That they raised a great army and sent it against Europe and North Africa. And this great army was on the march and was in these areas, claiming them, when the Central Islands were destroyed. Therefore, these armies could not return. There was no place to go back to. And many of them settled and mingled with the peoples of these areas to form some of these wonderful and mysterious civilizations which we have no real explanation for. We have very little explanation for how racial differentiation in recent times came about. The various anthropologists, so forth, have charts showing what happened. But as is the case in most of science, no one seems to know how it happened or why it happened. These things occurred. New bloodstreams came forth, mingled and mixed and intertwined. And each one brought with it part of its own culture. And these parts of ancient cultures seem to linger on, perhaps in lingual differences, in arts and crafts, in psychological structures, in habits and principles, and even to a measure in bodily form and structure. In any event, as Bacon points out, we have a challenge coming to us at the present time. And this challenge is more or less documented in terms of Atlantis, and I think this is the way Plato originally used it. You know, the story of Plato's Atlantis ends in the middle of a sentence. It was never completed. Bacon's New Atlantis ends in the middle of a sentence. It was never completed. Why? We don't seem to know. But I think that Bacon tells us about the importance of it, that the destruction of Atlantis, as left by the tables of Enoch, is the great story of the disaster of disobedience. That regardless of how we think about life or what we believe about life, it is impossible for us to go contrary to the will of heaven. Anything that goes contrary comes in the end to destruction. Plato and several others of the earlier writers also seems to fabularize this particular situation. Atlantis may be the submerged self in each of us. This is an interesting possible thought from a psychological standpoint. The psyche may be that part of our nature which alone bears witness to its ancient origin. If there is a record of disobedience and penalty, that record is probably primarily descending within the structure of the human being himself. It is something hidden in his own darkness. It is something that may bring him fear. It may bring him conscience. It may warn him of the dangers of the abuse of power and energy. And if so, it may be the submerged part of man's own nature, that part which was lost because of disobedience to the God. This may be the large, deep, all-spreading mystery of the fall of man, which has been also recorded in various ways among practically all peoples of the earth. Atlantis also seems to have a very great fascination for the psychologist and the social reformer. Is it true that a civilization existed long ago which knew what we do not know today? Is there something lost in our way of life because it disappeared under the waters of the Atlantic so far back in our story? Is it true that there were giants upon the earth in those days, mental giants, that had skills and abilities which they had derived from the studies of esoteric matters? Did black magic originate in Atlantis? It probably did, according to the Platonic discussion, because it was in Atlantis that for the first time man disobeyed the gods. And from disobedience fell the angels. The entire story of human progress, so-called, is today very largely a record of disobedience. The individual has broken the rules of life. Some people, having broken the rules of life, try to study esoteric matters, hoping to find the secrets of some strange magic of long ago. But if they are those who have broken the rules, and they are seeking a knowledge which they do not deserve, and which they do not have the character to use constructively, they could cause another deluge upon the face of the earth. Therefore, every effort apparently has been made in ancient times to protect the secrets of essential knowledge. There are records of legends and accounts everywhere of secret teachings, esoteric schools. There are accounts of ways by which the human being can develop faculties and powers at present beyond his capacity. The scoffer says the whole thing is superstition, that there are no such forces, but that isn't proven by scoffing. It is only proving by testing. I remember years ago, when I was in India, I met an old gentleman whom I make the hero of a book called The Guru. This old gentleman was a guru. I was never a disciple of his or anything of that kind, but I did know him. And we've talked about many things relating to the Yoga, Vedanta, Tantra of India. These secret arts which are said to have been given to the world by the gods in ancient times. And in talking about it, you see this old gentleman was sitting there very quietly on a little white square like a sheet in his room in a little stucco house in Calcutta. He was sitting there in about 11 feet of his own hair. So I said to him, I'm going back to the States, and as one of the holy men of India, have you a message you would like to have carried to the American people? And the old gentleman, sitting in the midst of his hair, where it joined his head it was pure white, at the outer end it was black, looked me straight in the eye and said, yes, there is. Tell the American people to be practical. That sounds like a very strange thing to say under the conditions. Because if there was anything that ever looked impractical, it was what he was doing. So I carried that question a little further. And he explained to me, he said, I would like to make a recommendation. He says, send over to us 5 or 10 of your best equipped scientists, the ones who have the greatest knowledge that your academies, the schools, universities, and institutions can produce. Leave them with us for 10 years, and they will reform Western wisdom. We've built it all on the outside, when in fact we have failed in the greatest mystery of all, the realization that within ourselves are the secrets we are searching for everywhere else. And also within ourselves are energy resources which cannot be exhausted, and that there can be and should be an over-science of life by means of which human beings could build a world that would endure, a world that would be worth living in for everyone who lives here. Now, the old masters of the magic of Atlantis lost all by perversion. They lost themselves and they lost their lives. They lost their world and their beautiful cities and their temples. Nothing remained because they failed. Now, at the moment, we can also remind again of the Atlantis of Bacon, namely what we have to do. He said, Bacon in the New Atlantis said that we might say the motto of the great Atlantean experiment was that man should learn to know all that is possible for man to know. Now, at the moment, we can also remind again of the Atlantis of Bacon, namely what we have to do. He said, Bacon in the New Atlantis said that we might say the motto of the great Atlantean experiment was that man should learn to know all that is possible for man to know, and should dedicate all he knows to the unselfish good of all that lives. Now, it's a pretty big order, and we're not working that way too well at the moment. But the principles still remain true. That when the individual works for himself, his empires fall. When he works for the common good, he builds that in which is the spirit of everlastingness. Now, among the mysteries that have been involved in the Atlantean story are the pyramids. And the pyramids are very interesting things. We know that they are in Egypt. We know that they're in Central America, but recently, a year or two ago, I saw aerial photographs of pyramids in the heart of China, which are not generally known, but they've been recognized. These pyramids, like the mounds of antiquity, seemingly have a meaning. And what that meaning is appears to be also rather uncertain. According to the conservative Egyptologists, and Mayologists for that matter, the pyramids were simply magnificent monuments to the memories of dead pharaohs, kings, and their emperors, or, if you want to be a little more idealistic, perhaps the testimonies to God and wisdom. But the pyramids are a very strange thing. Their distribution upon the surface of the earth is most extraordinary. Work is now being done, and I hope it will be carried on to a successful conclusion, to study and chart the locations of pyramids in relation to the magnetic fields of the planet. We know that the planet is a kind of crystal, that it has areas of fission, that it has magnetic fields, and that these magnetic fields are very important to the survival of life and to the distribution of energies. These magnetic fields may sometimes be the substitute for every method of locomotion or all forms of fuel in the world today. I went to the Pyramid of Giza, and I went through all the interior chambers of it. And there are some things about it that are very, very strange. Why should a tomb be ventilated? There are two great passageways leading from the king's chamber to the outside wall of the pyramid. They are like ventilators, not large enough for a person to go through, but large enough to permit a current of air. And then, after some time, no one knows when, the outer ends of these ventilators will block, but the openings to the inside are still open. The Great Pyramid's king's chamber has in the ceiling the largest stone, I guess, in the entire structure. It weighs many, many tons. The sarcophagus, so-called, has been largely nicked away by tourists, but it is a lighter stone box, much in the shape of a casket, but too small for a human body. The way the Egyptians mummified their dead and put one mummy case sarcophagus and over another before final interring in the stone vault could not have been done in this case at all. It's been utterly impossible. Also, another interesting thing happened. Way back in the days of the glory of Baghdad, the great Sultan of the follower and descendant of the great Al-Rashid of the Arabian Nights, Sultan Al-Rashid bin Mahmud, decided to open the Great Pyramid. He had been told that it was built by giants who were called the Shaddai, superhuman beings, and that within that pyramid, and those pyramids, they had stored a great treasure beyond the knowledge of man. So, taking his court with him, the Sultan went to Egypt, and he stood and looked at the Great Pyramid. And at that time, all the casing stones were in place. The four walls were perfectly smooth. There was no visible opening of any kind. And he didn't know exactly what to do. But he heard from legends where he supposed the entranceway was, and he began to dig there. And they had a very fine way of digging in those days, which I think we have improved on. They had to use cold tools and vinegar to go through the stone. And when they got through a certain way, they did find that they had come very close to an entrance. But a great stone blocked it, and they could go no further. The Sultan or Caliph looked at the stone. He said, "Take it out." So they went to work on that stone with vinegar and very soft metal tools. And after the great trouble, they managed to get the stone out. And as they took it out, another stone fell in its place. And they had to go through stone after stone before they could get into the building. Now you don't do that just to bury a burial. And at last, when they got all the way in, there was nothing. The only thing they found were a series of little implements, like a little a ball that could be used to make sure a surface was even. You stood the ball on it, if it rolled off, the surface wasn't even. And two or three other little tools, and the dimensions of the building itself. Now the Shaddai was supposed to have buried all this treasure. Did they really bury a treasure in there? Were those little instruments the treasure? And were the dimensions of the pyramid and its interior structure this priceless secret that was far more important than gold? It has been worked on. Some have decided that the Great Pyramid was a great book of prophecy. Some say that it was built by the Atlanteans. Some say that it has the most perfect mathematical form and the most perfect measurements of anything on earth. They have measured the orientation of the pyramid, and it's oriented up to the 8th and 9th decimal point. And the little error that does exist, this little fragmentary error, is probably due to the fact of the minor earthquake that shook off that corner. The building was built by somebody who knew a great deal. Now, if you only want to go back as far as Cheops or Khufu, we have to admit under those conditions that the Egyptians were pretty smart people. Because if they built the pyramid, they had a knowledge not only of architecture, but a knowledge of mathematics, and a knowledge of astronomy, and a knowledge of geography that was prodigious. They knew more about all of these subjects than we knew 100 years ago. Something in this story is another evidence that somewhere in the past there was a very great amount of knowledge. And if it was true, or is true, that the pyramid was oriented to the Star Vega, then the entire history of Egyptian philosophy and mathematics is set forth in that building. The Egyptians themselves, at a very early time, said that the Great Pyramid of Giza, Pyramid number 1, was originally the tomb of Hermes, and that in that building was the great key to the Hermetic philosophy, which was restored in Alexandria in the 1st century. Now Hermes, as the Hermetic tradition tells us, was the god of wisdom, a being known to the Greeks as Hermes, known to the Romans as Mercury, known to the Egyptians as Thoth, the god of writing. And the last poem, by the way, of Longfellow, was an ode to Hermes, in which he said, Trismegistus, 3 times greatest, how thy name sublime has descended to this latest progeny of time. Hermes Trismegistus, the embodiment of all knowledge that is knowable of nature. Hermes was the symbol of cosmic mind, of absolute knowledge. He was described as having written all the books of the world, because every book was written by mind. He was the keeper of the great secrets of life, the guardian of the mysteries. And this work includes a discussion of the Great Pyramid. Certain Hermetic books, probably written about the 1st century, but credited with a greater antiquity, include a work written by Hermes, presumably, to his son Tatian. And he says in this book to his son, he says, the day shall come when Egypt shall be no more glorious, that nothing will remain of this great empire except broken columns half covered for the sand. And that was written over 2,000 years ago from existing manuscripts. So the entire problem of Egypt ties into Atlantis, to the pyramids and other ancient monuments. Let's see now what we could say about this pyramid in study of man in the present stage of his evolution. For some reason we're not very sure of, the pyramid is on the reverse of the seal, the Great Seal of the United States. No one knows exactly why it was put there. No one knows who put it there. The custodian of the Great Seal, back about the turn of the century, wrote a book on the story of the Great Seal of the United States. And he said the reverse of the seal, the front of course is the eagle, the reverse of the seal has never been cut, for the reason that it is nothing but the dull symbol of an esoteric society. Well, that esoteric society, of course, numbered among its followers Washington, Franklin, probably Jefferson. But in any event, the seal was not cut. Now, the soldiers of the Revolutionary War were paid their wages in what we would term feudatory notes. They were simply local printing paper with practically no value. Nearly everyone who financed the revolution went broke. But these little notes that were passed around, one of them has that pyramid on it before it was on the seal of the United States. And later it was moved onto the state paper. Now, when was the Great Seal cut? It has been cut. It was cut during the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and has since been found on the reverse of our dollar bill. This seal is apparently the symbol of a monument which, according to the Bible, was set up in Egypt to bear testimony. It is quite possible, and people are beginning to work more and more on it, that the study of the pyramid is very, very important to the solution of our relationship to the ancient world. We like to think in our own way that we are just here to do as we please, that we can make the mistakes we like best, that there is no definite providence to guide us, that our ancestors are all dead, and that nothing was better than the Roman Empire. But we are not at all sure of some of these attitudes. And as our own problems increase, as they are increasing today, it becomes very obvious that we are not able to handle our own destinies at this time. We do not know where we are going. We have no idea of how we're going to get there. And about the only thing we can do at the present time is try to figure out how we can have more guns or bombs than somebody else as the basis of survival. Now, this doesn't really make very good sense. It is not the answer. There is a grand plan of life, a grand purpose. It has existed among every people, and every nation has finally turned away from it and disappeared. The ruins of the past are a constant record of the individual's inhumanity to man and his failure to keep the principles of his own survival. The science of survival, then, suggests that there must be a plan, and that plan must be available to man if he wants it, or is willing to do that which is necessary to have it. If he is not, he will not get it. Now, there's an interesting story we don't hear much about also. Hermes, among the books which he is attributed as having written, was one which was called the Black Book. Now, the Black Book is another legend. Very difficult to find much out about it, but one thing we know is that in England, the Order of the Garter was formed not because of an accident to a lady's garter, but because the original meaning of the word, as it appears, was gradually, we might say, colloquialized. It was the order of the Garter, the protector. And if you have visited the chapel of the Garter at Windsor, you will see the thrones of those who were the members of the order. And according to the ancient order, as recorded by its first great historian, Sir Elias Ashmole, back in the 17th century, the original laws and rules for the order were taken from the Black Book of Hermes on the deportment of kings. And the entire structure is so constituted and the thrones are so arranged that it represents really a heavenly temple in which all the gods of antiquity were seated. It is also a very appropriate symbol of the first great League of Nations. That it was a symbol of the union of the rulers of the world for the maintenance of peace. The Knights of the Garter were all rulers. And I remember when I looked at it, there up on the flag or banner of the chairs was the flag of the Emperor of Japan. The Order of the Garter was an international order of leadership. And the Knights of the Garter, in their right, drew their swords, overlapped them, and formed together a circle of blades resembling a great star. The Knights of the Garter were sworn to the protection of the weak, to the justice that is in the power of the ruler to bestow, and that all together, each in his own way and in his own faith, took his obligation to the God of his fathers to keep the peace. Then something happened. The Black Book disappeared. And the parts which had not been transcribed, which had to do with the rules of conduct down through time, have never been found. Again, something mysterious happened. But that it did exist, Ashmole assures us. The same type of thing comes with the order of the Round Table. Another type is with the legends of Charlemagne. All of these things go way, way back. But they all lead to one concept, namely that there is an over-government of the world. That this over-government is the government of the gods from their Olympian thrones as personifications of the great forces of life by which the universe is maintained. We do not have to believe in Olympian deities, but the integrities which they stand for or symbolize are the basis of human life. And unless these integrities are maintained, nations will fall. And every nation up to the present time has passed through great vicissitudes because of its inability to keep the rules of life. In the Greek and Egyptian worlds, those who were dedicated to trying to live a better life were gradually accepted into the mysteries. And these mysteries were among the things that Solon participated in when he was initiated into the rite of Osiris and Isis. According to the legend, Solon was taken into the basement or cellars of the temple. He was taken way down under the earth by the side of the Nile. And in the very depths of the earth there was a subterranean lake. And it was all black and dark. And on the shore of the lake was a little boat with a blind oarsman. And in the center of the lake was a small island. And on this small island were the two pillars of Enoch. So Solon and the priest who guided him went out to the island, and the priest showed him these strange hieroglyphic writings on these columns. And it described how how various destructions had afflicted the world. And it said that the Atlantean Empire was destroyed by water. But if the solution wasn't found, if the world did not become aware from the ancient evidence and from daily living that there was no way of breaking the rules of living and surviving, then another great civilization might rise. And if this one rose, and it was necessary to punish it, it would be punished by forces moving in the air. Solon took this back. Didn't know exactly what to do with it, but he realized that he had been in the presence of something very sacred, that the priests themselves believed this, and it was written on this column of indestructible metal that had been there before the dawn of time. Incidentally, there is a column in India that is much the same as in Delhi. It just looks like a pillar rising out of the ground, maybe 9 or 10 feet, maybe 8 or 9 inches in diameter, with a kind of a colophon on the top, and inscription in a language that no one can read. No one has ever been able to read. It looks like iron. But during the Sepoy Rebellion, that column was hit by a number of solid shots, cannonballs. The cannonballs were broken into fragments, and there was not even a dent on the column. It is believed that this column also goes to the story of the Orichalcums, upon which the walls of Atlantis were built. Everywhere you trace around, you find interesting things to remind us of something. And I think what it's trying to tell us is that we are one step in a great project, a project that leads from the primitive to the ultimately enlightened. That all along the way, just as human beings are young, grow old, and pass out of embodiment, generation after generation passes, so nations after nations come and go. The great thread of life is never broken, but there can never be an enduring culture until it keeps the rules. And these are the same rules that Plato tells us about, that Solon found, namely that we are surrounded by a tremendous field of energy. We are surrounded by the potentials we have no knowledge of. Space is full of the energies and life that we are trying to now find by artificial means. The human body is an incredible instrument, and its value has been largely destroyed by the fact that the owner of the body is unwilling to treat it properly. So nation after nation rises and goes down because it does not keep the rules. And this will continue until man, in one way or another, becomes aware of these rules. Now, the speculation about the Atlantic story, to my mind, should not be where was it and what was it, primarily. But the main question is to find out what the story means, and what it means to us today, to make this idea practical. We learn from this story, for instance, that a great civilization can perish. We learn that great empires can fall. But what we haven't learned, really, is that these disasters are caused largely by the corruptions of the human being. That man himself is his own destroyer. And that he will be his own destroyer as long as he follows the ambition of world domination, as long as he lives to conquer peoples, as long as he lives to accumulate an unreasonable wealth, where he is willing to compromise integrity for fame, where he is willing to live only for today and let tomorrow take care of itself. He should look back and see how the tomorrow of Atlantis took care of itself. The individual himself sickens and dies from his own corruption. Nations do the same thing. But in every nation that perishes, something survives. And one of the things that survives is a knowledge. A knowledge which can be reorganized, reintegrated, and reformed. We have gained from the past many skills and many wonders. But these are not enough unless we ensoul them. We can gain any skill we want. As today we are working with computers. We can have all the computers we want, but then we'll be born and suffer and die just the same, unless we use these computers to solve the great problems of life. And having found that those answers can be discovered, live by them when they are found. All knowledge has as its final purpose that the individual shall overcome his own ignorance, and that society shall overcome its compound ignorance. And ignorance is nothing but the belief that we can break the rule and survive. So the Atlanteans left us this message, and Mayas left it to us, that the great world patterns, the great world systems with which we are concerned have all perished from one source. We call it ignorance. And it is ignorance in a sense, because as the Chinese point out, any individual who does wrong is ignorant. No matter how learned he is, no matter how many years he spent in school, no matter how many honors have been bestowed upon him, no matter how much wealth he has accumulated, if he has not the understanding of the importance of complete integrity, he is ignorant. Ignorance is the inability to use wisely what the skills of the mind have given us. And until we realize this, we will be perishable. And just like the Atlantis of old, we shall be teetering on the edge of oblivion unless we ourselves make the necessary changes in our concepts and our conducts. Bacon pointed out that there was, in the great city of the New Atlantis, in Solomon's house, there was a tremendous collection of all of the arts and sciences that man had known. That in here, all the wisdom, all the value that humanity had accumulated was in a great museum, a wonderful place, a gallery. And also here were the busts and statues and portraits of the great illumines, those who had given man the great donations and gifts of wisdom. Here was made available to the individual the accumulated wisdom of the ages. Everything of astronomy, of medicine, of art, of literature, everything of science. So, each one coming into the world comes into this gallery, and here he sees all that the world has done, all the achievements of the past, and then he is reminded of the simple fact: you have seen all these things. You know they have been accomplished. Therefore, your problem is to take these things and use them for the good of all that lives. Unless somebody somewhere along the line comes to this conclusion and takes this attitude towards all knowledge, the dangers of the deluge remain. The danger that we will tear down or lose a tremendous asset by abusing its use. Actually, it is the same in our personal lives. Unless we control our minds and emotions, unless we organize and rectify character and conduct, we are abusing the priceless privilege of growing, which is our birthright. And those who have abused the birthright get into trouble. So Atlantis stands for a lost cause. Not lost because the gods merely wanted to destroy a people. Atlantis was destroyed because it was too dangerous to let it live. It meant that if it was not destroyed, evil would spread throughout the world. would afflict all peoples, would tyrannize and dominate and corrupt everything that exists. Before this can happen, so many laws are broken, so many energies are abused, that all these broken rules and these abused energies get together and destroy the source of the corruption. Just as evil creatures, bacillus, virus, and all these things, come and destroy bodies that have been made infirm. So in the Atlantis story, we have a moral lesson of importance, in addition to a fascinating ancient fable. Thank you very much.